I'll make it official. So, good morning. Hope everybody's doing well. Um, on the way in, you may have heard me say that I'm having internet issues here. So, I'm not sure why or what, but if I go away, that's probably why. But it seems like it's sort of settled in. It took about 10 minutes to log on. So, excuse me. Hopefully, now that I'm on, we'll be good. Let's look at the weekly question. Also, if you sent me an email, I got a bunch of emails yesterday and just wasn't able to answer. So I will, between classes, answer email. So yeah, I don't know, but I'll answer those today. And a whole bunch of looked like I need an answer right now sort of thing. So sorry. Excuse me. Oh, but I will answer email today between classes. Hopefully that'll help you. Um, so chapter um, 15 is the rights to be working on 14, but 15 is what we'll be talking about a bit today. Reconstruction, a success or a failure, or something in between. In your response, consider land policy, key legislation during presidential radical reconstruction, Southern politics, racial and political violence, and Northern fatigue. So I know it's a ton of stuff in there. And as I probably have mentioned before, really key things that I expect to see in this answer, some discussion of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. That just has to happen. Don't just list them, mention what they do, even if it's just in parentheses, like 13th Amendment, then parentheses, frees the slaves, 14th Amendment, equal protection and citizenship for former slaves, 15th Amendment, voting for former slaves. So it's not like it would take a really long explanation, but just give me a clue that you understand what those amendments are. And I really think your answer should end with the bargain or compromise of 1877. So if it doesn't, that's going to be a little problematic for me. Somewhere in the middle, you've got a ton of stuff you can put in there. I would assume since it says land policy, key legislation, radical reconstruction. You would mention the Reconstruction Act of, I think it's 67, where they set up the 5 military districts. Um, and you can talk about, there's a ton of stuff you can talk about. We'll go over, more stuff as we go through the notes. But you could also talk about the Force Act or Enforcement Act, talk about the development of the KKK, which I know is not exactly a law, but it is some Southern resistance. Um, and it fits with that racial and political violence section. And I think that mention kind of screams out for you talking about the KKK. Um, but there are different reconstruction bills you could talk about that happened before the military reconstruction. But the military reconstruction thing is a pretty big deal as well. You can talk about who the presidents are, at least mention. You have Johnson and Grant during that time period. I suppose Lincoln kind of sort of at the beginning, but not really because he gets assassinated so early. He doesn't do anything actively after the Civil War ends because he only lives about a week after the Civil War officially ends. So talking about Johnson, things that happened when Johnson's president. Try not to completely ignore the Grant presidency, even if all you put in is the declining use of the Enforcement Act. The Enforcement Act allowed the federal government to suppress the activities of the KKK. And also within some of that legislation, it allowed the 5 military district governors to bring in the military during elections so that Black voters felt protected and safe. Because part of what the KKK did was threaten to harm them if they voted. So KKK was part of their original goal, clearly not the whole thing, was voter suppression. So there's a ton of stuff that you get to talk about in there, but at the very least, amendments and bargain of 1877, and stick a couple things in the middle as well. And it's your last weekly question. The continuing issue with weekly questions, for those of you not getting all the points, is, or most of the points, is that you're not putting specific examples, which might include names and dates and events. So, it's a history class. We like that stuff. And whenever you can answer using examples in chronological order, we kind of like that as well. So it sort of shows change over time or cause and effect. So, all right. And then the May 10th optional assignment, and of course you've got the book review due really quick. But the May 10th optional assignment is pick something that wasn't covered in a weekly question and talk about it, and talk about the who, what, when, where, and why. Why does it matter? What was it? Why did you choose it? Any of that stuff. So, and detail and analysis, of course. So be specific. Don't, like, I wouldn't pick a big topic like racism or something like that, because that's, I mean, unless you want to spend a whole lot of time showing different racist events over time, I would pick I would pick a person or a specific event or a law or something like that, just because it'll be easier to cover. And it'll be easier to be really specific about it and cover it well. That's what I would. All right. Oh, goodness. All right. I'm afraid you're going to hear me whining about my throat a lot. So. All right. Who makes their notes look like this? I forgot. It's really strange. All right, let's get to chapter 15. Okay. And just as a reminder, if you forgot what the amendments are, they're in the notes at the end of chapter 14. Also, I've had a couple of people email me and ask me where they can find the answers to the weekly question for 15. I would, it's the whole chapter, so I know that's not very helpful. But if you're looking for a specific event, I always recommend that you use the index of the book. And you just look the stuff up by name and it tells you what page number. So index, yeah, the index is your friend. All right. I feel like we talked about impeachment maybe last time a little bit. So if not, we'll just do a gentle reminder about impeachment. When Andrew Johnson became president, he had been part of Lincoln's version of the Constitutional Union Party, which really meant that Lincoln was rewarding Johnson for his loyalty to the Union by letting him be vice president. He was a Democrat. He was a senator from Tennessee. Tennessee had officially seceded from the Union, but Johnson didn't think secession was a good idea, so he continued to serve in the Senate. So as a reward for his loyalty to the Union, Lincoln made him vice president. Now, the thought was vice president doesn't really do anything, which is often true. But in this instance, because Lincoln gets assassinated, vice president gets to be president, and it's an enormous problem, really. I mean, for the process of Reconstruction. Johnson is going to allow the former Confederates to essentially rebuild their congressional delegations however they feel. No congressional legislation regarding Reconstruction had passed, so how they're supposed to be allowed to send their representatives back hadn't been decided. Johnson just said, do whatever you like. He pardoned several high-level Confederates, not, like Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis, but, field officers, that kind of stuff. And when the northern version of the Congress noticed the southern version of the Congress coming in, they just said, we are not going to certify you. And Congress and Johnson started fighting. about pretty much everything. So, excuse me, when Congress would pass laws, Johnson would veto them. And then oftentimes Congress would override those vetoes, which really hadn't been done much before. Excuse me. So there'll be more vetoes and more overriding of vetoes in this administration than all other administrations combined. So it's rough. It's a sign that the folks aren't getting along. So Congress will eventually pass a bill called the Tenure, Tenure of Office Act, right here. Tenure of Office Act is where it's mentioned. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. How did that happen? So Tenure of Office Act. And this said that Andrew Johnson could not fire his cabinet or other Senate approved officials without permission of the Senate, which is unconstitutional. And they did this because they knew Johnson was about to fire William Seward, who was Secretary of State, and he was Lincoln's last remaining cabinet member. And Johnson didn't get along with him. To be fair, he gave Lincoln a hard time as well, but he was just kind of a cantankerous fellow. He had lots of strong opinions, and they often agreed with Lincoln. They his opinions, that is, but he rarely agreed with Johnson. So Johnson was going to fire him, and Congress said, you know what, we'll just make a law that says he can't fire William Seward because we know that's a law he'll break, and then we can impeach him. So that's what they did. And you're probably vaguely familiar with impeachment because we've done it a few times recently, twice with Trump, once with Clinton. I know you weren't around for that. They started it with Nixon but didn't complete the process, and Johnson's the only other president that gets impeached. But the House, you know that the Congress is divided into the House and Senate. The House has the duty of bringing the articles of impeachment. So they're like a grand jury, and they decide, are we going to charge the president with a crime? And so they charge him with a crime. It's the statute says they have to find a high crime or misdemeanor, so he has to break a law. So in this instance, the law he broke was the Tenure of Office Act. The House said, yes, he broke it. And then the Senate has the trial. So the Senate is like once you get indicted by the grand jury, you go to trial and you have the 12-member jury and the judge, that sort of thing. So this is that version of a trial, but for the president in the Senate. So impeachment has two parts, the House part, the Senate part, so you can be impeached but not convicted. And that's what's happened to all presidents who've been impeached. I know a couple of you going like, that's not what happened to Nixon. Yeah, because he wasn't completely impeached because they never had the trial in the Senate because he resigned. Yeah, so, all right. But Johnson gets impeached for a violation of Tenure of Office Act. He figures it's unconstitutional law. He, of course, vetoes it. They override it. He breaks it. They impeach him. He is not convicted because a handful of Republicans decide that the impeachment was really just political in nature, and that because since they passed a law specifically knowing he was about to do something that would break that law, that they sort of set him up. They also, the lead Republicans had conferences with his lawyers and said, look, if you just don't kick him out of office, he'll settle down. And of course, he was in the last year of his term anyway, and he wasn't going to run for re-election. So all those things combined led to the Senate not convicting him. And I think it was 6 Republicans voting against impeachment, which is what they would have needed, or against conviction and impeachment. And that's what they needed to make sure that he was not kicked out of office. So he'll finish his final year. He doesn't run for re-election as president, but he'll take a year or two off, and then he comes back as a congressman, which is sort of a weird thing for a president to do. We saw it with John Quincy Adams. We see it with Johnson. Johnson will come back, and then when he's sworn in and reseated, he gets a standing ovation. They allow him to give a speech, and then he curses at them for impeaching him. So Johnson. All right. Andrew Johnson orders the federal government to return any confiscated land to former plantation owners. So that reverses that Sherman's field order, which and other instances that allowed former slaves to own land that had been owned by their former owners. So this kind of fits in that section with land policy in the weekly question. So even though there had been Sherman's field order that allowed certain former slaves to own land or possess the land and run it as their own, Andrew Johnson will order the federal government to return any confiscated land. And then the major system that former slaves work under is the sharecropping system. So if you're not a landowner, which was true for honestly almost everyone in the South, because you still have that very small percentage of people who had been plantation owners who are now the major landowners because they're not technically plantations because, there's no more slavery. What they do is they hire their old slaves and they say, you don't have a place to live, so we'll let you live in your old slave quarters, but I will deduct that rent from your pay. And you also don't get paid until the crop comes in into the sharecropping system. So then I'll loan you the money for your rent until the crop comes in. So they charge them rent plus interest on the rent because they couldn't pay the rent. They also charged them for the tools that they used because they didn't technically own them because they didn't have any money. Those were tools given to them during slavery, so they were allowed to charge them money for the tools. So, and also they didn't have money for food and for other things they needed because they didn't have money because they were slaves. So they start off with debt. They start off owing their former owner, now their employer, money because they can't pay the rent, they don't have money for food, and they don't have money for tools. So they work their land, they deduct rent, that sort of stuff from their eventual pay and interest for all of the items that they used. So what ends up happening is when the crop comes in and everybody gets paid, typically the former slaves still owe money to the slave owners. And they're going to pass laws that say that if you're in debt, you can't leave your job. So they'll establish this system under sharecropping with former slaves that really kind of holds them to continuing to work for their former owner. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, weren't most whites in the South poor and they weren't landowners? That is correct as well. And they lived under a similar system. So now they may have had a separate place to live. They typically did, but the financial situation wasn't dramatically better. They had a little more independence and the law protected them more if they were white sharecroppers. But financially, white and Black sharecroppers were in very similar situations. Crop lien is slightly different. You might be a landowner, but you can't afford the seed or the tools that you need to plant a crop. So you borrow those from someone, you farm the land, and then when the crop comes in, you repay them. The problem with the crop lien system typically is that if there's a season where the crop fails, then you have probably pledged your land as collateral for the loan you got for the seed and other items that you needed to put in the crop. So if the crop doesn't come in and you can't repay the loan, then the person you got the loan from can confiscate your land because you put it up for collateral. Collateral, I don't know that you have a big concept of collateral, but you have a loan. Sometimes they ask you to put up collateral, which means if you don't pay off the loan, so it's something of value that the bank or whoever loans you the money can take away from you if you don't repay the loan. So, oh, goodness. And it's usually like in the modern era, it's probably whatever the most valuable thing you have, your house or your car is typically what it is. But what you'll notice if you look at banking systems is typically poor people, people who would have to put up collateral to get loans, can't really afford the loans. So they don't get loans very often. Loans are often for wealthy people who probably need them because they're getting more interest on their investments, so they don't want to take money out of their investments to pay for something. So I'm not saying that people don't get loans for houses and cars. Clearly they do, but those larger loans probably harder for poorer people to get. You can always get a loan for a house or a car, whether the interest rate is good or not. But if you don't pay on your loan, they just take the house or the car. That's your collateral, essentially. All right, more stuff. Excuse me. Women's rights groups are not always thrilled about the 15th Amendment. So the American Equal Rights Association, which is the big women should have the right to vote group, and other rights as well, is going to split into two groups because of their reaction to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says that former slaves have the right to vote. Sorry, some women are going to register, are going to try to vote and get put in jail for this. So they're going to try to use legal means to get the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, and they're not successful. So then they're going to begin to push for an amendment to allow women to vote. The National Women's Suffrage Association opposed the 15th Amendment unless it included women. The National American Women's Suffrage Association said the 15th Amendment is fine and let's add one for women. And the difference in those really is going to be part of the rhetoric. So the NWSA is going to argue that it doesn't make sense to let uneducated Black men vote when educated white women do not. I'm cleaning that language up a lot. So this is going to appear to be very racist, mostly because it is. Well, it's not just racist. It's assuming that white women are more educated than Black men, which I know is racist, but it's something in addition to racist. So it's not the high moment of the women's suffrage movement or feminism. The American Women's Suffrage Association, different tact. What will eventually happen is the two groups will come back together in 1890 and then push for an amendment to allow women to vote. Because by then, I mean, the 15th Amendment's pretty well established, and then, of course, in the South, not enforced. So they'll push for what eventually becomes the 19th Amendment. Now, there are many successes during Reconstruction that the book will go over a few of these. There's certainly more that if you happen to have read something else for your book review and you know other stuff, feel free to put it in. But here are things you can mention as far as successes in Reconstruction. Black men are voting in the South in very large numbers, at least for the first 6 years of Reconstruction. African American congressmen are elected in southern states in the 5 military districts. Hiram Revels, Blanche Bruce are sent to the federal Congress, along with their probably the more prominent fellows, along with 14 other African Americans. State legislatures, if you ever go and tour the US Capitol and you see all the pictures of the legislatures from the years, if you find the old ones, you know, in the 1860s and 70s, you will see African American men, and over 600 African American men serve in their state legislatures during Reconstruction. You're going to see the development of traditionally Black colleges during this time period, Black-owned businesses, in large part because not a whole lot of white guys in the South are going to hire Black guys, but you will see African American men and women too, but men become more successful economically. And you'll see folks get elected to Congress who had been former slaves. So what you'll notice if you study that is they govern in a judicious way. Everything seems to work well. The reason I mention that is there's a lot of I guess propaganda would be the right word, but there's a lot of literature written during the era that suggests that it's part of the reason that state and local governments fail during this era is because they have Black legislators. That's certainly not what's going on. And I mean, I'm not sure exactly who decides whether the state and local legislature failed, but it's right after a civil war. They're working on fixing the damage of the war, plus they're using a budget deficit probably because the major economic factor, the selling of cotton, is really not going well during this time period, and the Southern economy is not very diverse. So there's lots of problems in the South during this era that are unrelated. I mean, they're just part of what happens when you lose a war. So um, there's a lot of money, maybe not enough. I mean, who decides that? But there's a lot of money poured into Reconstruction from the federal government. And because of that money, you also see people move to the South or relocate from one place to another to either help with that rebuilding or to participate in government contracted work, so to get money for their companies. And if those people who come to the South do that come from the North, they're referred to as carpetbaggers. The reason they call them carpetbaggers is the carpet bag is a suitcase. It's the bag made out of carpet, hence carpet bag. So, if you ended up on a train, which probably isn't where you went out, but maybe on in a wagon or something like that, it protects whatever's inside the bag a little bit because carpet's thicker than your average cloth, which is what they would have made. I mean, you could have, I guess, potentially made a suitcase out of leather, but you wouldn't have seen that very often during this time period. So the Northerners who came to the South to help with Reconstruction were called carpetbaggers, and the people in the South did not see them as helping. They saw them kind of the way, no offense if this fits any of you, the way that native Texans see people who moved into Texas, or especially Californians who move into Texas. So the carpetbaggers, when people called them carpetbaggers, they had kind of you're an outsider, you don't understand what's going on here. You came here because you think you can gain an advantage, but you're probably going to make it worse for those of us who are already here, that kind of feeling. So people were not excited, especially when folks relocated from the North, because they were going to bring their Northern values, and they're the reason you had the Civil War to start with. So people are not going to be excited about seeing Northerners. Scalawags, sometimes looked down on as well, especially by plantation owners or former plantation owners. These are Southerners who cooperate with Northern reformers and officials during Reconstruction. So when the Military Reconstruction Act was passed, 1867, I think it was 1867, might have been a little later, but this was the act that separated the South into 5 different military districts and gave them all a district governor who usually Ulysses S. Grant was one of them, but they were usually Northern military officials. And those 5 military districts, the states within those districts were not allowed to have their own governments until they ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments, which none of them ever did. So they continued to be governed during Reconstruction by their military governors. So when scalawags were people who lived there but said, you know what, let's just make the best of this. I'm going to get some government contracts. I'm going to work with the military governor, the Northern officials, the federal officials, and do whatever I need to do to help with Reconstruction. Now, the people who resisted those folks were sometimes thought of as redeemers, and they, of course, looked down on carpetbaggers and scalawags. So, these are Southern pro-business Democrats, often, who sought to regain control of Southern governments from freedmen, freedmen are the former slaves, carpetbaggers and scalawags, and restore whatever Southern tradition is. And when they gain control of legislatures or when they get elected, they will locally especially start to reestablish slave codes under the guise of black codes. So they're going to start to restrict the freedom of former slaves and also the influence and impact of carpetbaggers and scalawags. So, and they will be persistent. So eventually you'll really see what they want kind of take over with the bargain of 1877. They often paired with white citizens councils or KKK groups as usually the same. So a white citizens council is really the government arm of the KKK, so local government, and elected officials who are KKK members to regain political and economic control. Now, what is noticed during this era, well, I was going to say, is that really the end of my notes? No. Okay, what's noticed during this era is that the KKK is really beginning to have some success at suppressing Black vote in the South. So the federal government passes something called the Enforcement Act or the Enforcement Acts, or they're sometimes called the Force Acts or the KKK Acts. And they're really designed to allow the federal government to send troops to the South to suppress the KKK and protect Black voters. And in the first Grant administration, you will see Southern governors ask for federal troops to come during elections, during federal elections and state elections, and the federal government will send those troops. During the second Grant administration, you will notice that the federal government becomes less and less likely to send those troops. So there's less and less protection for Black voters. So then Black voters have to decide, is it more important for me to stay alive or is it more important for me to vote? And they typically go with stay alive because there's some practical application to that, isn't there? They're used, okay, so the enforcement acts are used less and less frequently as the second Grant administration lapsed into corruption. And your book will talk about a little bit about the corruption during the Grant administration. Grant is unwell. He's sick. He's got cancer, and he's not going to survive. And this is really more of a factor of his second term. He also, I don't think anybody thinks he's personally a dishonest fellow, but he does have some dishonest people that he picks to work with him. So there'll be several scandals. There's something called the Credit Mobilier scandal, where a bunch of congressmen form their own company, a fake company, to bid on railroad contracts that Congress is awarding. So they'll award themselves a railroad contract, and then they will subcontract with someone else and pay them substantially less. And there aren't very many things that are illegal during that time period as far as business. That's one of the few. So some folks will get in trouble and go to jail over that. There's also going to be a scandal with a fellow, William Belknap, who is Grant's personal secretary, and he's going to take bribes from businesses to allow them to go have operations, trading posts within Native American reservations. And he'll get caught, and that'll be a problem. And I'm trying to think what the other big scandals during that era are. So we had Credit Mobilier, we had the Belknap scandal and with the BIA. But there are several scandalous things that happen within the administration, within the Congress, and even though certainly there's no evidence to suggest that Grant authorized any of those things, they happened during his administration while he is distracted by his health and by his worries about providing for his wife and his family. So he's also trying to write his memoir before he dies because that's going to be his only way of earning money. I know some of you are thinking, well, didn't he earn money from his Army pension? Not very much. Or from being president. And during that era, you really didn't earn much money being president, and you tended to spend more than you earned because you didn't necessarily get a big budget for entertaining, hosting dinners, and things like that at the White House. So a lot of times the president had to dip into their own money to pay for some of those events. Certainly not true in the modern era, but um, being president I mean, you've seen politics enough that in the modern era, we really don't have anybody become president who isn't rich before they're president. So they don't do it for the $400,000 salary or the fancy house. They become president for other reasons. I'm sure all noble, but in the modern era, all of our presidents are rich, with the exception of Bill Clinton, who wasn't, but then is now. So, and you can make a lot of money after being president in the modern era. That was not true in the old era. So, and Grant was a relatively poor guy. All right. Excuse me. Compromise of 1877. You have the two Grant terms, and the second one is, increasingly ineffective in a lot of ways. The southern states are starting to do essentially whatever they want without a whole lot of oversight from the federal government. And we have just your standard presidential election with a lot of standard cheating in the vote counting, apparently. So there's a fellow named Tilden and a fellow named Hayes. You've got Rutherford B. Hayes and William, I think it's J. Tilden. Tilden's a Democrat. Hayes is the Republican. They run against each other. Incredibly close election. Some dispute in the voting counts. So the Democrats and Republicans will both help with the recounts. They'll get different numbers. By the time the federal government intervenes, what they can do in a disputed election and what the Constitution requires them to do is send that election, to the House of Representatives, because that's the one that most directly represents the voters. It's elected every 2 years. It's proportional representation. So they're supposed to decide who will be president in the event of a disputed election. So the House said, no, we're not playing that game. And they created a commission, which eventually had 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And shockingly enough, they voted 8-7 to let the Republican be president. And then the southern states are like, this is not fair. We are going to secede. So they ended up making a deal. And the deal is the Compromise or Bargain of 1877. So within this deal, a couple things. Thing number one, it allowed the Republican Hayes to become president. Thing number two, it allowed the South to have a few cabinet members. I think the most notable one was the Postmaster General during that, which might have been more important then. The federal government would finance a railroad in the South from Texas to California to help improve commerce. But the major thing is highlighted there, the end of Reconstruction by removal of the troops from the 5 military districts from the 1867 law. I know I kept saying maybe it was later, but it was 1867. So once the troops are removed, then the South can have their elections however they want, and they don't have to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now, if you're wondering, does that mean that the 14th and 15th Amendments don't apply in the South? No, it doesn't mean that at all, because the assumption is you're back in the Union, you have to accept the laws that were passed without you. So the end of the Reconstruction happens with the Compromise of 1877, and that is the removal of the troops from the southern states, the end of the 5 military districts, and the southern states get to conduct their elections however they see fit. Which leads us, of course, to the big discussion of successes and failures I don't know if I have anything in your notes here. No, I really don't. So you'll have to decide, of course, whether it's a success or a failure. What I would do, and this question's due next week, so we'll talk more about it next week as well. But what I would do is start off with the explanation of what Reconstruction was, and then talk about whether there are different ways you can structure it. You can have a section where you talk about the successes of Reconstruction, a section where you talk about the failures of Reconstruction, and then a conclusion about whether it was more one or the other, or if it was an even mix of the two. You could also talk about some key events, and then as you talk about those key events, talk about how they were part of the success or the failure of Reconstruction. So however you want to structure it, just make sure you have a plan as you go in. And in the question, it lists all the, lots of things that you could talk about: land policy, key legislation, Southern politics, racial and political violence, Northern fatigue with Reconstruction, and again, to make sure why you define it as a success or a failure. So you can't just say it was clearly a success or it was clearly a failure and not say why you would categorize it in that way. All right. I feel like that's probably about where we're at for today. And then next week we'll kind of wrap up the weekly questions, see if you have any questions about anything that remains. And if you weren't here a little earlier, I said that I would go through and answer your emails between classes today. So I noticed a lot of emails yesterday that I didn't get a chance to answer later in the day. So I will go through and answer your email today between classes. Now, before we go, and before I stop the recording, are there any questions that you would like to ask right now? Oh, goodness. All right, I will stop the recording and kind of double check the roll, so don't leave just yet.